Hello and welcome everybody to the second podcast of the Jewish Stand. I'm so delighted to welcome Sam Myerson. Sam holds degrees in ancient and medieval history from UCL and the University of Birmingham. He works as a teacher of history in West Yorkshire. Sam also lives not too far away from me in Leeds, and outside of his career, Sam's interests lie in politics and popular culture. I'm so delighted to invite you, Sam. Sam wrote an article called "What is Zionism" in the 2020s on the Jewish Stand. Please check it out. It's such an excellent article. I couldn't recommend it more. And I think it's such an excellent time to have you on, especially after the last podcast that we had from Shaked, to have a very different view on things. So without further ado, Sam, how are you and how's your family?
Well, thank you very much. Lovely introduction. Don't know if anyone's ever been so complimentary of anything I've written before. But yeah, I'm very good. School is winding down for the year, but my workload is not, so busy. But yes, very, very happy to be here, recording indoors instead of enjoying the lovely weather outside.
Yeah. Today is a beautiful day, and with people, as if we have any international audience, wouldn't know that England is not generally as beautiful as it is today outside, with blue skies and birds chirping and very nice weather. And we both have our windows open, so if you hear background noises, It's probably because we're trying to enjoy the fresh air. So let's get right into it, Sam. First question: your article about Labour Zionism again, and if you haven't read it, please do. But it essentially explains the founding of the State of Israel. So could you explain that a bit more for our listeners who may have not read your article?
Yeah, absolutely. For clarity, do you mean the founding of the State of Israel as its own topic for this question, or specifically Labour Zionism within it?
Sure, you could do both if you want.
Okay. That wasn't what I was expecting. Well, first of all, I'm just going to say it once at the start, and so I don't have to preface every question with it. I in no way view myself as an expert. I'm someone who's grown up within the Jewish religion and Zionist ideology my whole life, and spent a lot of time attending Jewish and Zionist youth groups, and had a year in Israel with B'nai Akiva. So I feel like I've got decent credentials, but I'm not a political expert. So everything I say comes from my perspective.
Yeah, that's true without saying.
Yes, but you know, from my perspective, Israel was founded in 1948. Actually, that's not perspective; that is fact. But it was founded in 1948 after years of struggle against British colonialism. I don't view Zionism or the establishment of the State of Israel as Jewish colonialism at all. I view it as a homecoming and as a struggle against the powers that wanted to deny us being there in the first place and made it difficult. And do you know what? I was reading a really interesting comment online on Reddit of all websites that described the early days of Israel as the sort of most recent Wild West, which actually I do kind of agree with. You know, for now, we take for granted the big metropolitan areas of Jerusalem and especially Tel Aviv, but these weren't necessarily present in the early days, certainly not Tel Aviv, which was founded pretty much ex nihilo from nothing. So it really was, in many places, small communities, small villages or settlements, moshavim, kibbutzim, whatever you want to call them, linked together through land that is geographically pretty inhospitable in many places, and facing people that were also pretty inhospitable as well. Didn't necessarily welcome a Jewish presence there. And as more and more Jews settled under the British mandate, they began to urbanize, and they began to fortify where they lived and grew. And once the State of Israel was founded, and we had many refugees coming from other countries, especially from Muslim countries in the Middle East, these people found themselves, oftentimes not intentionally, but at the forefront of new town, cities, and settlements. So just sort of from a migratory aspect, it's a really interesting point in time. In terms of sort of the role of Labour Zionism, I think Labour Zionism was in part an ideology that benefited from it being the Wild West, or I guess the Wild Middle East. Labour Zionism, for those not in the know, is a rejection of sort of mainstream capitalist ideas and embracing Jewish culture and Marxism, and so felt that it needed a strong agricultural class, generally centered around the kibbutzim, farming collectives and communes, as well as an urban proletariat, a strong urban working class. And because those people tend to be the largest demographics, and those were the people who were living in Israel at the time, there wasn't the sort of comfortable tech bubble elite as there is now. That ideology flourished and was very prevalent for a number of decades. Do let me know if I'm rambling at all, by the way, or if you want further clarification.
Not at all. Not at all. Please go ahead.
So, yeah, now I'm trying to think where I go from here. So Labour Zionism was just one of many different types of Zionism, and I suppose still remains one of many different types of Zionism. The biggest one, sorry, let me rephrase. Israel was founded on the backs of all of these different types of Zionism. Perhaps the most famous one and the most famous thinker might be this idea of political Zionism, as envisioned by Theodor Herzl. The idea that the state of Israel could only be formed through acceptance from other great nations and foreign powers. So the Ottomans, the British, we're thinking sort of pre-World War I as this was going on. But that wasn't the only school of thought. I've touched on Labour Zionism, but another key aspect of it was the rejection of embracing foreign powers in the foundation of Israel. The state of Israel had to be founded at a grassroots level through hard work by the people moving to Israel. And you had other forms of Zionism as well. Religious Zionism is probably the most famous one today. The idea that Zionism goes hand in hand with religion and with Judaism itself. It is not a separate political movement. And others, which I'm happy to go into detail, but I don't necessarily know if they're relevant to the question right now.
No, absolutely. And you definitely get a sense also from your article, but from what you're saying, that there's so many different strands of Zionism, but they all essentially say the same thing: a homecoming of Jewish people to the land of Israel. It's actually the antithesis of a settler colonial project, which many on campus are trying to, especially when I was on campus, advocating for Israel, and all we'd hear was, oh, but Israel is a settler colonial state. So how do you find that? And when you look at the history of it, and this is why it's so important to really understand the history, is that it's the exact opposite. It's actually so many different facets of Zionism, and each one of them are, driven by a common purpose of setting up a Jewish homeland back where it used to be, back in the ancient borders. And it is so interesting to see how, we've distorted it today. How do you think that happened?
How I think that happened is a massive question.
Well, more specifically, I guess it's we know that as much as Labour Zionism ruled Israel after 1948, right? You also mentioned in an article. We saw that there was a very big rejection today amongst the left of Israel. So that sort of is a very interesting twist on the subject, right? I guess is more the question.
Better. A slight, not better question. Sorry, not at all, but an easier question for me to answer, possibly. Zionism was always going to be rejected by the hardcore left, and not necessarily because it is a Jewish movement, although undoubtedly that doesn't help, but because it is a nationalist movement. And, true hardcore left-wing thinkers, much more left than myself, and for reference, I view myself as centre-left and quite proudly of it, but hardcore left-wing thinkers, communists, capitalists, the most serious of socialists, reject this idea of nationalist movements and believe in a sort of, I guess, cross-community across the entire world. So the fact that it is such a prevalent nationalist movement was always going to be unpopular. In terms as to why Zionism specifically as opposed to other nationalist movements, I think it's probably a mix of inherent anti-Semitism in the West, which I think the West is uncomfortable in admitting. There has always been anti-Semitism in Western Europe in one way or another, be it based on religion, as it was in the early days, or ethnicity in the 20th century, or now when people use politics as a cover. Perhaps many people would argue that a rejection of Zionism and the state of Israel is just the new form of anti-Semitism. And I think there is something to be said there for that. I also think, and I have to be very careful with how I phrase this here, there is a current uneasy alliance between the left wing and what we're seeing as sort of some Islamic supremacists, or at least those people who would not have an issue with having Islam as a state religion. And this is for reasons that I think go beyond the scope of this. But I think there is also the fact that the entity of Palestine, whether you want to view it as its own sort of wrong state or a disputed territory or a non-entity at all, is a predominantly Muslim one. And many people view the conflict in Israel-Palestine not as to do with land, but to do with religion. So I think in part that has not helped either. So it's a big question as to why the left don't embrace Zionism. But I think there are a lot of reasons, and I've covered some of them. I'm sure there are more we could think of if we had a lot of time.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves, because I still want to really stay on a bit more on that, on the history of Israel, because sometimes, the history is what really sets up the rest of everything. Because the arguments that we have today mostly rely on the history of what happened. And definitely we saw that, labor Zionism, not only was it one of the fundamental features of creating fundamental instruments in creating the state, it also ruled the state. So there was a left-wing socialist government until the 70s, when Begin first won the election. Was it 1975, if I'm not mistaken? And that was a very big upheaval in Israel, because until then Israel was seen as a socialist country. Could you maybe touch a bit more on that? Like, how did that happen? What do you think of that?
I admit now we go sort of less into my area of expertise, the specific history. But I think in general, after a while, the sort of true Marxist socialist ideas become rejected as people grow more comfortable, and it really not in a critical way, but more selfish. They sort of reject these ideas of communal sharing and move towards a more individualist ideology. And in the early days of the State of Israel, that just wouldn't have been considered, because there were so many great existential threats to Israel's existence that people wouldn't have put themselves against the need of the community. So not just under British colonial occupation, but also during the wars for independence, or even the Six-Day War, these were big threats. You can talk about sort of Golda Meir's faults in recognizing wars and political danger, but I think really there was always going to be a rejection of hardcore labor Zionism as Israel began to normalize its relations, or at least not be at active war the whole time with its neighbors. So that's it from my perspective there, and I think that sort of is a nice prelude to a further question when we talk about the position of Labour Zionism today.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember speaking to someone here from the community whose father was a refugee from Europe to what was then called the Mandate of Palestine. And they asked him as he was leaving it, actually it must have been just after the independence. So he was met by Jewish immigration officers. And it was a very interesting story because they asked him, I think he was part of a youth movement in Europe, and they asked him, are you a communist? Are you a socialist? I don't remember exactly which one. And he said he was the other. And they didn't like the answer that he gave, and they threw him, into a city somewhere to get his hands dirty and work there rather than give him a nicer job where he wanted, I guess. And you really get a sense of like, when I asked my friend, so what was he? Was he actually a communist or a socialist? And he said he had no idea. He just answered what he thought they wanted him to answer. And I think, especially the upheaval after the Holocaust, right after what happened. And all that was going on, whether the whole of Israel was really socialist, did they all believe in it, the people who were living there at the time, or was it they saw the dangers of immediate extermination from the immediate outset, right? As soon as Israel declared independence, we famously know that they were declared war upon by surrounding Arab nations, and heroically they won. But it wasn't a victory where they thought that that's it, we're going to live in peace now. It was very precarious. The land, the enemies were at the border. They wasn't sure what was going to happen. And as things stabilized, I think, like what you say, we definitely see that move towards a more capitalist outlook. Famously, I remember Begin, when he was elected, he famously said in one of his political speeches, "There's no more protectia, no more protection." If you know what that means, it's essentially protectia is the Israeli method, which is still around today, which goes to show how much of it was actually realistic, of appointing people that you knew were party loyal. So if you were a socialist, you'd move up the ranks. If you the one we read more, I highly recommend Yehuda Avner's The Four Prime Ministers, where he really discusses it in depth from the inside of how the political movement looked. So that was then, and I guess we really touched a lot about the history of it. Let's move on a bit more to modern times. So like I said, it was after the Holocaust, and from your article, we really get a sense of the purpose and the mission that those Zionists, the Labour Zionists, the ones who really believed in it, and also the rest of them, what they held. So how do you contrast that with modern-day Labour Zionists?
Well, it's a good question. Like, how do we contrast sort of the Labour Zionism of the past to, I wouldn't even necessarily say Labour Zionism today, because I think it's such a non-entity, but certainly left-wing Zionism, I think, is the better comparison. I think we've mentioned it already, but Labour Zionism of the past had a real purpose, and it wasn't just to cultivate the land, but it was also a form of protection. Each kibbutz, each settlement was guarded and was looked out for by their own. And I think if we look now, well, the land is for the most part developed. The settlements, rather the kibbutzim, the moshavim, the villages within undisputed Israeli territory are for the most part protected. Obviously, there are tragic exemptions to that, but for the most part, they are protected and secure. And so really, the only place you see, or the only places you see that traditional Labour left-wing ideology in action, ironically, it is in those sort of nationalist settlements in the West Bank, where they do still need to protect themselves, and they are still developing the land around them. I think, and I'm not an expert on current Israeli politics, and I don't claim to be, but I think Israeli left-wing Zionism tends to define itself more by what it's not than what it is, in that it is not Benjamin Netanyahu. And there is, that can only get you so far. They don't offer, I think, a clear vision, because if they did, I feel like as a left-wing Zionist, that vision would have been clear to me. And this isn't just in Israeli society, we see it all over, right? So in the UK, the Labour Party got in not necessarily because of its policies, although admittedly I do like a fair few of them, but more because the fact that they were campaigning themselves to be not the Conservatives. And although they have a large political majority, that political majority comes from the fact that people are fed up with previous Conservative rule. Israel's already gone through that stage when we had Bennett and Ram and everyone in government. That was a party whose only, or that was a government whose only vision was, let's take a break from Netanyahu. And we can see that it failed and it was rejected. Now, was that really a left-wing government? Not particularly. But a lot of the arguments the left are making just seems to be Benjamin Netanyahu needs to go. And personally, hands up, I agree with that. But you need to offer something more hopeful, something of more substance. And this is a problem which the left is seeing in Britain, that the left saw in America, and that it still continues to see in many places in Europe as well. The messaging just isn't there, apart from we are not them.
It's really, really striking to see it also from your article when you write what founded Israel, sort of. And this is obviously open to debate amongst history, which we'll hopefully have later on. Maybe there's a follow-up article here, but the kibbutzim, right, the symbol of the left-wing Zionism. So today, it's the total opposite. Today, it's more akin to a sort of a private members club. Many of them are, at least. There's a famous one in Bental, in the Ramat Golan, in the Golan Heights. And I know when I was stationed there in IDF, it was a beautiful place, but it was also very rich. It was people who bought into it, and very much a gated community, far removed from the communist and agrarian and equalitarian ideology that founded it. And it's kind of striking to see how it's so different to what it came out. It's so far removed. Maybe do you think that's like a symptom also of how far away modern day labor Zionism, which whether it exists or not, is so far removed from its inception?
Yeah. Having, I spent my year, I've only spent a year maximum in Israel. I spent it with Bnei Akiva, which, aside from being a religious group, was traditionally a religious socialist group as well. I think people sometimes forget this. But they are still big on kibbutzim. So I spent time on a few different kibbutzim. The kibbutz where I spent time working was very similar to what you described. It was comfortable. People's houses were nice. There wasn't, communal housing. There was a sense of community, but in the sense that it was like almost kind of a gated neighborhood. And the people there did work hard, and most of them did sort of traditional kibbutz-related jobs. So there were farms, there was fishing, there were cows. I worked with the chickens. And they also said those who work off-site have to use some of their income to contribute to the kibbutz. So I still had some of the original ideas behind it, and it was a lovely place, and I'd love to go back. But when I visited a kibbutz much more closer to the border of Gaza, that felt almost kind of like being on a frontier. And I do wonder if the sort of tension that you feel from being able to see Gaza very close by sort of led to a much tighter-knit community. There was still, while I wouldn't say that no one was living in their sort of communal housing, the houses seemed to be a bit smaller. People banded more together for things like childcare. I didn't get a proper look because I was only there for a couple nights. But I do wonder if that is more akin to what the kibbutzim of the old were like. But I do agree that there's not really a point of a traditional kibbutz anymore. The point of the traditional kibbutzim was for protection and to cultivate the land, but they're protected, the land is cultivated. So a traditional kibbutz can only exist on purely ideological reasons. And that is
hard to do because most people want a comfortable life.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's this inherent crisis, really, of it's an identity crisis, really, at the heart of it, of what used to be the ruling party in Israel. And you kind of see a lot of its consequences in some of the very strong protests against Netanyahu, which are very politically driven, but not because left and right, but because of personality, right? Like you said earlier, it's very much personality. So I guess maybe we can move on to it already. The next question is, so from the article and from what you said before, we guess that you're not a fan of Netanyahu, and in fact you call his government extremist, and there's certainly many Jews in the UK and around the world, and including in Israel, who feel the same way you do, and yet he continues to win elections. He must have some form of vision. How do you feel about that?
Well, I mean, obviously not great. I find it's hard to put myself out there and make that call out, because one question I struggle with is, as a Jew who's in the diaspora and doesn't really have a particular inclination to leave anytime soon, what gives me the right to call out the government and do that? And I think it comes from a number of places, and one of them comes from Netanyahu himself, or his government. I think his government has made it very clear that Israel is the Jewish state, in that he wants Israel to represent the Jewish people, not just be a country where Jewish people go. And if that is the case, then I am included amongst that, and therefore, by that definition, me calling out that government should not be an issue. And as you've also alluded to, he's not necessarily popular in Israel. Obviously, he wins elections, but we do have to be careful because that comes with a big asterisk. He doesn't get more than 50% of the vote. He gets comfortably under it. Because of the way proportional representation works, he's the largest party in government, or he's the largest political party in terms of representation, but he still does not have an outright majority. And so he has to work with other political parties. And this isn't necessarily something that I disagree with or think is a bad thing. I think the government should be representative of the people. But I think who he has gone into government with has become more unsavory over time. So Netanyahu's traditional political sphere, and I'm happy to be corrected, but to me always seemed to be secular centre-right. And I don't necessarily have a colossal problem with this. I think provided that people are left to their own devices, in a social way, and that some form of benefits and social care is provided for the people, I think largely I would be able to get behind that. But my issue is he's skewing more and more nationalist and more sort of religious. And to me, that is a problem because he's having to compromise his identity, but it seems the people he's going into government with compromise very little. And they are often able to say things that previous members of the Knesset, were they in government, I don't think would have been able to say, or at least not been taken seriously. So comments recently about, putting 2 million, the end goal of Israel in Gaza is putting 2 million Gazans into a massive prison in southern Gaza, refugee camp, as they are wording it, in southern Gaza, but then turns into a prison because they're not allowed to leave, is, I think, abhorrent and really concerning. And Netanyahu may or may not agree with this. Certainly in the past, I think he would have disagreed with it. But the issue is, if someone in government is saying it, and he is giving them a platform, and even if he's not actively endorsing it, he's letting it be said without pushback, he does in fact endorse it by default. So
the aspect or the issue is with proportional representation. He's burned bridges in the centre, he's burned bridges on the left, he's only got the religious and the right to turn to. And the religious and the right are popular, because that is, I think, probably the fastest growing demographic in Israel. Religious people just have more children. That is the fact of it. But as I said in my article, they appear to be one of the only Zionist groups that still have a clear message. And I don't agree with this message, but it's there. In that, they want to resettle Gaza and then settle Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, the occupied or disputed territories, whatever you want to call them. And that is a clear political message that they can wrap up and sell to the people. And once again, we're looking at the position of left-wing Zionism today. I don't know what message they have beyond "we are not Netanyahu, therefore you should vote for us." So I don't feel great about Netanyahu consistently being in power. I think he's a very clever political operator. I think he's gone as far right and as nationalist and as sort of religious as he can go in politics. And it would be interesting to see if there's another election, what he does next, or whether his party remains the largest, because you'd have to think that some secular centre-right people would not approve of what Netanyahu's done in this government. But I am comforted by the fact that it is not that he is popular or hugely popular among all of Israel. So there's a very definite group of people who don't like him, and the majority of the country did not vote for him.
Yeah, it's certainly, you see that he's got such a big hold over the political discourse in Israel. At the end of the day, today, if there's an election coming up, the main questions are asked of parties that are already, Eisenkot already is about to form his own party. The main questions that they are asked, and Gantz also, you see, is, will you sit with Netanyahu? It's more than just what are your policies. It's, will you sit with with a prime minister and his coalition, or will you not? That seems to really give you an indication of how much power that the person can hold in Israeli politics. And it makes sense, after all, he's been in politics for forever. He's been since the 90s heavily involved in Israeli politics, either leading it or somewhere in the background or somewhere in the middle as some form of minister. And I'd really want to touch on that part that you said at the beginning, where you explained so eloquently why, as someone living in the UK, and this is probably what a lot of listeners would feel the same way, we live in the UK, we most likely have family and siblings in Israel. We have feelings towards it. We have things that we disagree with and agree with, and yet we might not feel comfortable to air that because we're not there. We don't live in Israel. We don't know the reality of what's going on over there. And when you say it, it's because Israel wants to represent all Jews. And if that's the case, then we do have a say. And really, that's a lot of the arguments you find on campus, right? Because on campus, people ask you, well, do you condone Zionism? Because they see me as a Jew on campus. Well, why do you ask that question? Do you say it's because Israel is representative of all Jews, in which case we can have a different type of argument? Or is it because you try to, maybe say that every Jew has to have an opinion on Zionism? And it's really interesting. So how do you feel about that contrast here when you're arguing or advocating for Israel and people are asking you about your opinions on Israeli policy and you're so far away living in the UK?
If you're asked that question, that specific question, know that it is totally okay to say, I've never spoken about Zionism to you before. Why have you come up to ask me about that? You can't control the thoughts of other people. So if other people are targeting you with questions about Zionism because you are Jewish, then that is problematic. But it's problematic because of the way they view you, right? If you want to push back and argue with them and you want to take that line, then do be aware that that does somewhat legitimize their argument and almost sort of stereotyping of you. But I do think people are entitled to not answer or ignore those questions if they are being targeted solely because they are visibly Jewish. It is undoubtedly a difficult area to navigate. I will say, for me, and this is anecdotal, But for me, a lot of the Zionism we see in the diaspora tends to be more nationalist, more pro-Netanyahu. And that's not an anomaly to the Jewish diaspora from Israel. You see it with diasporas across the world. For instance, the big one is in Turkey. More people within Turkey will tend to vote for more moderate, less religious parties. People outside of Turkey who've emigrated away from Turkey will vote for more religious parties, vote for Erdogan and people like that. So this isn't an anomaly, but it does make it harder, I think, for those left-wing Zionists to speak out. And when they do, they often face backlash. I have witnessed it, although not firsthand. I've witnessed it to close family members. And you'll know what I'm talking about, but I don't think we have to elaborate further on it here.
Yes, I do, yeah. Living in Leeds, there is a lot of politics going on in Leeds. You'd be surprised.
Yes, there's a surprising amount of politics for so few people. But
as they say, 2 Jews, many more opinions.
Yeah. But know that Israeli politicians view themselves as representative of you, right? Anti-Semites and people who are against Israel's entire existence, right, which is anti-Semitic. We can talk about the ins and outs of being against specific aspects of Zionism or against specific parts of the government. But people who are against the existence of Israel full stop want to define you by your Zionism. They judge you as a Jew as being Zionist already. So you might as well let rip with your opinions, no matter how counter-mainstream they are, because you're being represented one way or the other.
That's a nice message. So as much as I'd love to carry on this insightful discussion, we have to wrap up with one last question, which I guess can go either way. So we spoke about Netanyahu giving his message, and it seems like the right has a message. So for you, Sam, what does the future hold for us Jews and also for Zionists?
This is going to be such a cop-out, but I don't know. But
yeah, that's okay.
I am going to go with... No, and I think it's fair not knowing, but I will go with my yearbook quote as saying, if you will it, then it is no dream, which seems apt for this conversation. But Jews have always been about self-determination. It hasn't been possible for a long part of our history, through oppression or through forced assimilation or through just wanting to forget. But self-determination has always been a large part of Judaism. And really, the future of Judaism looks like whatever you make of it. If you are not a fan of this sort of hyper-nationalist, verging towards, ultra right-wing and ultra-religious, or starting to become ultra-religious forms of Zionism that we're seeing emerging right now, then it is your obligation to stand against it in some way, even if it's just writing an article and appearing on a podcast. If you agree with that view, and I personally disagree with it and would disagree with you, but you have a duty to do what you think is right. So the future of Judaism and Zionism is purely whatever we make of it right now. But, classic cop-out, what that is, I don't know. I'm not certain. But hopefully it's a positive one.
I think that's such a beautiful message to end them, because that is what the Jewish Stand is built to do, is to really create that future. We might not know what it will lead to, but if we want it to be positive and more united and stronger, well, like you said, as Herzl said, right? Well, you wrote it in your yearbook, but it was mentioned before by Herzl. If you will it, it is no dream. Sam, thank you so much for joining us for this podcast. It's been an absolute delight to talk to you. And please stay tuned for the coming podcast that you'll be seeing in a couple of weeks. Thank you guys for listening and watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.